Hi guys, this is Caitlin Troy. Today I am going to be summarizing and discussing chapters 10 and 11 from Whistling Vivaldi. Here's my chapter 10 summary. This chapter is titled The Distance Between Us, the Role of Identity Threat. Throughout this chapter, Steele discusses the concept of identity threat and how it occurs in our society. So identity threat represents instances in which individuals feel the cultural attributes to which they belong have been evaluated negatively. Goff and Steele conducted research into the structure of modern American society. They wanted to learn more about what factors keep Americans divided. Even though we've made a lot of progress all throughout these years and throughout history, Americans are still very divided. There's this concept they reference a lot called de facto segregation of American society. So it's where Americans have increasingly been divided into smaller and smaller groups that is no longer just based on race, but also has to do with class, education, even political affiliation, and more. Philip Goff and Steele developed an experiment that could measure the impact of how they reference, in quotes, identity threats on association preferences. So Steele and Goff conducted this experiment. So they had white male Stanford students and asked them to speak with two students who were both black. Half of the white male Stanford students were instructed that they were going to be talking about racial profiling with the two black students. A different group, the other half of the white male students, were instructed they're going to be talking about love and relationship with these two black students. As part of the instructions, they asked the white male student to set up the seating and any arrangement that felt comfortable to have this conversation. The results of the experiment suggested that the way students grouped the three chairs varied with the topic of conversation. So they found that the white students who were told that they were going to be speaking about racial profiling sat their chair farther away from the two black students. Whereas they found that the white male students who were told they were going to be speaking about love and relationship sat their seat closer to the two black students. So overall, throughout this experiment, the results suggested that the white participants were aware of their own prejudicial behavior and were worried about seeming prejudiced. Then after they did that initial experiment, they conducted a very similar experiment. So the only difference between the last experiment and this new experiment is that they gave the white male students a test. And this test was developed to measure conscious and unconscious prejudice. So there's two tests that were given to these students to see how they are and are not aware of their prejudice towards other groups. Again, the results suggested that prejudice didn't have an impact on the seat distancing, but the fear of being seen as racist was the main factor. So they got the results from all these tests from the white male students, and they saw even if one of the white male students tested as more prejudiced, they still might have sat their seat closer than the other participants to the two black students. The big distinguish here was the topic of conversation. So the test didn't really factor how close or how far they sat next to those students. It was the topic. They found that a lot of white people feel anxious, feel nervous about having these conversations for coming across as prejudice. But in doing so, they then have these prejudice actions, which is what Goff and Steele really wanted to analyze and measure. For chapter 10, I picked the first three questions to answer and talk about. So the first question asked if I ever felt uncomfortable around certain people or around people whose identities were clearly different from my own and what that experience was like. So I have felt uncomfortable having sensitive conversations regarding race with people of color. My school has had a lot of professional developments this year talking about culturally responsive education, which is really amazing, but it is tough and it does take a lot of work. So then these PDs, we've had infinity circles, which if you're not familiar, is just small group circles and just having conversations, very real and authentic conversations. So I've done these affinity circles with my coworkers where we discuss race. And in these conversations, I usually am the only white person or one of a few white people. And in these moments, I feel this fear, this pressure, this anxiety to speak in a specific way. I get nervous that I'm going to say something that might be interpreted as racist or ignorant, or that, again, I'm not saying the right thing. So I resort to not really saying much in these conversations. I do remain silent. I allow the other white people or other people of color to facilitate the conversation. I don't like that this is something that's uncomfortable for me, but I am aware that this is kind of part of my journey to understanding my identity and race and prejudice, and this is something that I need to work on, especially throughout this course. Even these past 2 weeks, I realized that I can't step back and just allow the minorities or people who are more confident to have these conversations, because then my staff, we can't succeed if I'm not putting in the work as well. The second question asked if I've worked with students one-on-one and how their identity and my identity plays into that relationship. So the past 2 years at my school, I've had an advisory, and so this advisory is 15 randomly assigned students that I see every single day for a normal 47-minute class period. In advisory, I mentor these students emotionally, socially, and academically. When I first started working at this school, I was working with predominantly students of color. So all of my students are either Black or Latino. I was worried because I didn't want them to feel alienated from me because I am different, because I am white and they're not. In these moments, I realized their identity is so important, and I don't know much about it. I don't know what it means, to them to be a Black male student growing up in New York City. So I really have to take that time to get to know them, to understand who they are, understand their identity and how it affects them. I hope these things do help kind of break down those barriers that we might feel or might face as two people of different cultures. The third question asked if there are places that I would avoid because I'm not welcome because of some aspect of my identity. So I did want to talk about how there are places around my school and even neighborhood throughout New York City that I would avoid because I'm a woman. If I stay at work late to work and it gets dark, I know that when I walk to the train that there will be men making comments, and that makes me feel extremely uncomfortable and very unsafe as I'm just trying to walk home. However, I am white, so I am privileged, and I am privileged enough to not have had too many places where I feel unwelcome because of my identity here in this country. That is very true. So that was my Chapter 10 summary and analysis of my discussion questions.